Kyle Voss could feel the tremor in the steel beneath his boots as the command bridge rumbled with the shockwave from the first assault. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white, eyes locked on the vast black expanse visible through the viewports. A flash of orange rippled across the horizon as the first human colony went up in flames, bright and violent, like a star dying in the midst of its prime. "Captain, incoming!" A junior officer's voice cut through the chaos. The tension in his words matched the throbbing of the ship's hull. Voss didn't flinch. His sharp eyes never left the fiery orb on the screen. The sky was alive, a canvas of deadly silhouettes in motion, warships cutting through the space between the stars like predators on a hunt. Enemy vessels, sleek and dark, flitted from shadow to shadow, the trajectory of their strikes carefully calculated. He had seen it all before, the smooth dance of war. But this was different. The ship's sensors screamed, warning of multiple incoming missiles. Without hesitation, Voss barked orders, his voice sharp as shards of glass. "Brace for impact. Shields up to full power. Prepare countermeasures." The bridge vibrated again, a brutal force that rattled every corner of the room. The flashing lights dimmed momentarily before bright red warnings lit the space, like blood flooding a battlefield. Officers scrambled, fingers flying over consoles, but Voss remained still, eyes glued to the viewports. The missiles were closer now, visible to the naked eye. Bright trails of fire, their paths crossing the black void like streaks of lightning. The pulse of the ship's energy shields hummed through the deck, a low vibration that could almost be felt through the soles of his boots. But this was no ordinary impact. The human resistance had a way of making every blow count. "Full throttle," he commanded, cutting through the scrambling sounds of his officers. He knew how it worked. Humans would try to outthink them, outmaneuver them, and overwhelm their systems. They weren't the strongest militarily, but their unpredictability was their deadliest weapon. An explosion rocked the ship, and for a moment everything slowed. The stench of burning circuits filled the air, a sharp metallic tang that made his gut churn. He fought the urge to cough, squinting through the smoke that rolled in thick clouds. His crew was still moving, still functioning. He couldn't afford hesitation. The enemy ships moved in closer. Voss clenched his jaw. These weren't just another species, another skirmish. The humans, these stubborn, resourceful creatures, were more dangerous than they seemed. He turned to the officer at the helm. "Get us out of here! Activate evasive maneuvers." "Commander," the officer hesitated. But Kyle's focus shifted as a shriek of metal filled the room. A series of loud, deep thuds reverberated through the hull. Something massive had struck their outer layer. No conventional weapon, no simple ship-to-ship blast. The words of the briefing officer echoed in his mind. "The humans have developed a weapon capable of affecting the very fabric of space-time itself. Their unpredictability is their strength." The officer beside him, voice trembling, turned to Voss. "They're not stopping, sir. It's... keep moving." Voss's order was sharp, but even he could feel the hesitation in his own chest. It wasn't fear, not quite, but it was something akin to it, an instinctual acknowledgement that the humans had something that didn't fit the rules. There was a flash. The enemy fleet's lead ship erupted in a series of sparks. Explosive pressure pushed against the front lines, an almost audible pop of energy that filled the air with an invisible force. But what startled Voss wasn't the damage. It was the speed. The entire maneuver took place so fast that no one on the bridge could fully comprehend it. 1 second, a solid ship. The next, a shattered wreck in an expanding cloud of debris. He watched in stunned silence, his heartbeat a slow thud in his chest. His fingers gripped the console, grounding him. "Commander?" The officer's voice was hushed. "Did they just—" The words barely left the officer's lips before the next barrage struck. But this time, it wasn't missiles. No, it was far worse. It was precision. Human strategy was like a fine-tuned instrument. Every action deliberate, every strike executed as if part of a grand, unseen symphony. Every movement, every twist, was designed to force their enemies into a corner, to make them fight their own battles. The enemy had just been taught that lesson. Voss straightened, the tension in his body palpable. His mind raced, darting from one thought to the next, calculating possible outcomes. This wasn't just an attack. It was a declaration, a statement of force, and worse, of human will. "Sir," the communication officer spoke up again, pulling him back from his thoughts. "We've received a message from the humans." Voss turned sharply. The message had to be a threat, a taunt, perhaps a form of surrender or negotiation. It didn't matter. "Put it on screen," he ordered. The face of a human appeared on the screen, a young officer, his face eerily calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. He was dressed in the simple uniform of a human fleet officer, but his presence was commanding. His eyes were focused, unwavering. "We surrender," the human officer said. A wave of confusion swept over the bridge. The phrase was unexpected, jarring. Voss narrowed his eyes. "Surrender? From the humans?" The officer continued, his tone colder now. "But not in the way you think. You've made a fatal mistake. You came for our colonies, but you've awoken something far worse. You'll wish you had never crossed into human space." The transmission ended abruptly, the image flickering out like the last breath of a dying star. Voss felt a chill run through him. The unspoken truth hung in the air. This wasn't just a war. It was something far more dangerous. A calculated decision. A reckoning. "Prepare for full-scale engagement," Voss ordered. "All hands to battle stations. This is no ordinary enemy. We fight for survival now." The room fell into a quiet, steady rhythm as his crew readied themselves for what was coming. Carl Voss's gaze shifted once more to the stars outside the viewport. There was a new understanding dawning in his mind. The humans, for all their flaws, had one weapon that no one had prepared for. Unyielding unpredictability, and it was far too late to turn back now. The view outside the command bridge shifted as Voss's fleet began its retreat. The silence that followed the sudden burst of explosions felt unnatural. He stared at the display, his mind still grappling with the events that had just transpired. The human officer's warning, cold and matter-of-fact, echoed through his thoughts. "You'll wish you had never crossed into human space." A coldness settled into Voss's chest, a sense of unease that gnawed at him even as his ship made its evasive maneuvers, cutting through space like a blade through airless void. The sensation of the ship's hull shuddering beneath his boots was no longer comforting. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of his fleet. The warships that had once felt invincible now seemed like nothing more than fragile glass against the unstoppable tide of human ingenuity. "Report!" Voss barked, eyes narrowing on the distorted image of the retreating enemy fleet as it faded into the distance. The communications officer glanced over his console, his face pale under the bridge's harsh lighting. "The enemy fleet is pulling back, but they're not done. It looks like they're regrouping for a secondary strike." "Damn it," Voss muttered under his breath. They were adapting too quickly. The humans had barely unleashed half of their fury, and already the invaders seemed to be reorganizing like they were expecting it. He clenched his fists, fighting the unease that twisted in his stomach. The battlefield was nothing like he had ever experienced. There was no traditional ebb and flow, no predictable patterns to exploit. These humans, they weren't simply fighting. They were shaping the war with every move. They didn't play by anyone's rules but their own. That was what frightened him most. "Get the fleet back into formation," Voss commanded. "I want full scans on the retreating ships. We're not letting them off that easily." The order was clear, but his voice lacked conviction. He had learned the hard way that when a battle fell off, when the usual rhythms of war failed to materialize, it meant something was shifting beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite grasp yet. He didn't know why, but he had a sinking feeling that the worst was still to come. A sudden vibration rippled through the deck, followed by a shrill alert from the communications system. Voss snapped his head to the officer at the console. "What is it?" he demanded. "It's a distress signal," the officer replied, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "From one of our forward posts. It's humans." Voss narrowed his eyes. "Explain." "We were wrong, sir. The humans, those we thought were in retreat, have launched another assault. They've hit our forward defenses. They've cut through without warning." The officer's voice was tinged with an edge of awe. The words hung in the air like the echo of a final blow. Voss stared, his pulse quickening as a deep realization settled in his chest. "We've underestimated them." His words were quiet but heavy. The humans weren't just a threat. They were an evolving force, one that wasn't bound by the limitations of any conventional doctrine. "Divert all ships to intercept. We can't afford to lose those defenses. Full throttle." The bridge erupted into action once again, but this time it wasn't the same frantic scrambling. There was an energy now, a nervous anticipation. They had entered new territory, and everyone knew it. Voss turned his attention to the viewport once more. The stars beyond were cold and distant, untouched by the turmoil below. For a moment the blackness of space seemed to mock the disarray inside the ship, but then an image flickered into view, a scan from the forward post. It was a new human ship, smaller than the others, sleek in its design, yet radiating a sense of purpose. Its velocity was unlike anything Voss had seen before. The ship's engines pulsed with a rhythm that was both elegant and dissonant, a stark contrast to the raw, harsh engines of the Xerian fleet. The ship moved with a fluidity that was almost graceful. The human fleet had adapted, it seemed, to something entirely different. "They're moving faster than we can track," one of the officers murmured. "I don't care about their speed," Voss snapped, his eyes still fixed on the screen. "I care about how they manage to turn every advantage into a liability for us. Their weaponry is—" He paused, narrowing his eyes at the display. "It's precision. Precision on a scale I've never seen." He could feel his thoughts tightening, like a trap slowly being sprung around him. The idea was slowly taking shape in his mind, but the full understanding still eluded him. "What's the status on their fleet's communication?" Voss asked, trying to focus his mind. The communications officer hesitated before answering, eyes flicking nervously. "Sir, they're not communicating the way we expect. No standard military signals. It's as if they're anticipating every move." "I know," Voss muttered. He leaned forward, fingers brushing against the console. The officers were speaking in terms of battle, but to him the real question was no longer about tactics. It was about the nature of the humans themselves, their unpredictability. "Why would they—" the officer beside him started, but the words trailed off. "Because they're playing a different game," Voss answered, his voice low, "and we're not even in the same league." There was a momentary lull in the action as everyone processed the implications of his words. The bridge became tense, a quiet sense of realization hanging over the crew. They had underestimated their opponents. Outside the viewport, the first salvo from the human fleet erupted. Missiles, but not the usual barrage of random destruction. These were calculated, precise, aimed with an intensity that sent shockwaves through the Xerian ships. The first missile struck, and the sound was like a thunderclap in the vacuum of space. The distant shockwave reverberated through the hull, not as an echo but as a shock of pure force. Another explosion, another. Cale's breath hitched, not from fear, but from a deepening understanding. Every move they made was controlled, a part of a much larger, carefully orchestrated plan. "Report!" Voss snapped, his grip tightening on the console. "We've lost contact with the forward post. They've been completely disabled." The officer's voice faltered. Kyle's eyes narrowed. The humans didn't fight. They dismantled, piece by piece, methodical, relentless in their single-minded drive to crush everything in their path. And then it hit him. The next move. He had to be careful. He had to be smarter than them. "All ships engage," Voss commanded, his voice firm. "This is no longer just a war. This is a test." The battle raged outside, a tumult of explosions and the crackling of energy shields. But Voss's mind was already racing forward. The humans had already won one battle, but it wasn't over. Not yet. Not as long as he had breath in his lungs. The dimmed glow of the command center flickered, casting long shadows across the room as the tension from the previous assault hung thick in the air. Voss stood still, his eyes locked on the viewports as he watched the battle unfold. A complex weave of destruction playing out like a dark symphony, in the vacuum of space. His mind churned, not with thoughts of tactics, but with the underlying question gnawing at him. What are they planning? Every move the humans made sent ripples through the fabric of the galaxy. Their strikes were not only physical, but psychological. The invaders' ships, once confident in their might, now seemed uncertain, disoriented. The human fleet wasn't just outmatching them. They were turning every weakness into an advantage, every vulnerability into a trap. It was as if the humans could predict their next steps, even before they could themselves. "Commander, we've lost contact with several outposts," the communications officer said, his voice carrying the weight of growing concern. "The humans, they've isolated our communications." Voss barely registered the words. His eyes remained fixed on the chaotic view of shattered warships, bodies of fallen fleets tumbling in space like discarded debris. In the midst of the battle, the human ships moved with a strange, eerie precision, like predators circling their prey, always one step ahead. "Get me a direct line to the fleet," Voss snapped, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to regroup. No more distractions." The officer at the tactical station punched in the command, but the silence that followed was unsettling. For a moment the tension stretched taut, hanging in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm. The usual hum of the tactical displays seemed muted, as if the very ship itself was holding its breath. "I can't raise them, sir," the officer said, his voice strained. "It's like they've vanished." "Vanished?" Voss's tone was sharp. "They're not ghosts. Get me a solution." The officer fumbled with the console, sweat trickling down his brow as he desperately tried to access any form of communication with the rest of the fleet. But the more he typed, the more fragmented the data became. Signals distorted, crackling like an old transmission fading into static. "What are they doing?" Voss murmured, more to himself than anyone else. His gut twisted with the uncomfortable realization that this was no ordinary war. The humans had long since abandoned the rules of engagement. They weren't fighting, they were dismantling piece by piece, and they were doing it quietly. "Commander," the officer at the helm interrupted, his voice trembling. "Incoming. It's fast." The words barely left the officer's mouth before the sound of metal scraping against metal filled the room. Voss's heart raced as the ship lurched violently, sending a jolt of cold fear down his spine. Alarms blared, filling the air with shrill warnings that seemed to reverberate deep into his bones. It wasn't just an attack. It was an ambush. "Shields now!" Voss barked, his voice cutting through the panic. But it was already too late. The explosion was immediate, violent, and deafening. The entire hull seemed to tremble, the ship groaning as if it were about to split apart. Voss was thrown to the side, his body crashing against the bulkhead with a sickening thud. He fought to regain his bearings, his vision swimming as the room spun. The tang of blood filled his mouth, the metallic taste sharp and bitter. His chest ached from the impact, but he didn't have time to focus on the pain. The ship was taking damage, heavy damage. They had underestimated their opponents once again. "Report!" Voss shouted, rising to his feet despite the world around him still spinning. His ears rang with the aftershocks of the blast, but his eyes never left the tactical display. We're compromised, sir," the officer at the helm stammered. "We've lost half of our external systems. They're targeting our weak points." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Voss's mind raced. How are they doing this? "Sir, the human fleet," the communications officer called out, his voice hoarse. They're no longer in the vicinity. We've lost all visual contact." Voss's gaze snapped to the officer. The humans weren't retreating. They were doing something far worse. They had disappeared into the shadows, slipping through their fingers like sand. It was as if the humans knew something they didn't. They were acting on a plan that no one had anticipated. "How long until we can reestablish visual contact?" Voss demanded, forcing himself to focus. The officer didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were edged with uncertainty. "We're not sure, sir. The comms are being jammed, but it's different. They're disrupting our signals in ways we haven't seen before." "Impossible," Voss muttered. his mind racing as he pieced together the scattered fragments of information. The humans weren't just jamming their communications. They were interfering with them, disrupting everything they had taken for granted. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, grounding himself in the reality of the situation. The human fleet had proven it was capable of everything they couldn't predict. Every moment felt like it could be the calm before the storm, and Voss wasn't sure how much longer he could hold his own ship together. "Prepare all units for direct engagement," Voss ordered, his voice cold and measured despite the chaos around him. "We're not waiting for them to come to us. We're going to them." The officer hesitated. "Commander, we don't know where they are. The fleet is scattered. If we move forward, we move forward. Now." Voss's words were sharp, the finality in his tone leaving no room for further debate. As the officers scrambled to carry out his orders, Voss turned his gaze once more to the viewports. The space outside was still, unnaturally calm. There were no enemy ships on the scanner, no sign of the humans. Yet, somewhere in the blackness, hidden beneath layers of deception and strategy, Voss knew they were out there, waiting, watching. Their unpredictability was a weapon more deadly than any fleet could ever be. And now, he was about to face the full weight of it. The ship's hull groaned again, the sound distant, but still enough to remind him that time was running out. Every second they spent in the dark was a second closer to their doom. The mystery of the human tactics wasn't just a puzzle, it was a trap, and they were walking right into it. Voss clenched his fists. The next move would determine everything. There was no turning back. The next moment something flickered across the screens. A faint signal, then another. The humans were coming, and they were coming faster than he could ever have anticipated. "Full alert!" Voss roared. "They're not finished with us yet." And somewhere in the darkness, the humans smiled. The alarms blared, filling the command center with a frantic urgency that shook every officer to their core. Voss stood at the front, eyes scanning the cold blackness of space through the viewport. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the railing, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The enemy was out there somewhere, silent, but not gone. He could feel it, a quiet pressure in the pit of his stomach, like the weight of something ancient, something inevitable. The human fleet had vanished again. Their ship signatures flickered and disappeared, as though they had melted into the void itself. Voss could only wonder how they did it. The humans had a knack for slipping through the cracks, weaving their way into places where no one else could follow. It was disorienting, maddening. "Sir, we've got something," the tactical officer called, voice strained. He quickly patched the data to the main screen. A weak signal blinked into view, a pulse of light in the vast emptiness. Voss's eyes narrowed. It wasn't much, just a faint trace of movement. A small object, far outside the radius of their fleet, on the edge of the human-held sector. The size of the object was too small for any ship, perhaps just a scout, a probe. But the faint pulse it emitted sent a chill through Voss's spine. It was deliberate, purposeful. "Track it," Voss ordered, his voice cold, cutting through the tension. The communications officer's fingers danced across the console, his movements precise, but shaky. "Tracking, sir. The signal's unstable. It's bouncing, shifting, almost like they want us to follow it." "Or lead us into a trap," Voss muttered, his mind racing. There was something about the way they were being herded that made him uneasy, like playing a game where the rules were always changing, where victory was never certain. The humans had done this before, baited enemies with a false trail, only to circle around and attack from the shadows. "Do we engage?" the helm officer asked, her voice steady, but the uncertainty was there, palpable. Voss's jaw tightened. "Number, not yet." He couldn't afford to be reckless, not now. He needed answers, and he wasn't about to charge into the unknown without understanding what was really happening. The human fleet had proven itself capable of things he couldn't comprehend, things that twisted his understanding of combat and strategy. As the crew worked, the pulse from the object flickered again. A heartbeat in the silence. For a moment it was the only sound that filled the room, the cold rhythm of their uncertainty. "We've got incoming!" a voice shouted from the back, breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. The ship shook violently, throwing Voss off balance. He barely had time to catch himself before another jolt sent the deck lurching beneath him. The lights flickered. Sparks flew from a damaged console, the acrid stench of burnt circuitry filling the air, sharp and acrid. "Shields!" Voss barked, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Activate full power! Countermeasures now!" But it was too late. A second impact hit, and the ship groaned under the strain. The shockwave from the explosion sent ripples through the ship, vibrating the walls and rattling the floor beneath their feet. Voss's teeth clenched as the sound of the strike rang in his ears. The void outside had been silent just moments ago, but now it screamed with energy, sharp as a blade. The crew scrambled, their frantic movements a blur as they tried to stabilize the ship. The view on the display shifted. Dark shapes flickered in the distance, too fast for the sensors to catch. Then, another ripple of energy surged outward, more powerful this time. Voss stared at the screen, his breath caught in his chest. "They're here." Human ships like shadowy specters appeared out of nowhere. One moment nothing, the next a fleet of sleek, almost intangible vessels swarmed into view, barely visible against the void, their movements so fluid, so precise. It was as if they had materialized from nothing. "Commander, they've got us surrounded," the tactical officer said, his voice laced with panic. "We're in a firing zone." The sight was surreal. The humans didn't need overwhelming firepower. They didn't need numbers. It was their control over the fight, their mastery of unpredictability, that made them so dangerous. The ships glided smoothly through the debris field, picking their targets with an eerie calmness, like predators moving through tall grass, unseen until it was too late. Voss's eyes flicked to the crew members at their stations. Their faces were a mix of fear and determination, but he knew there was only one option left. He couldn't afford to waste time second-guessing. They had to make a move. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Voss ordered, his voice cutting through the growing panic. "We won't wait for them to dictate the terms." The ship veered sharply to the left, the hull groaning as it strained against the force. The view outside spun in a dizzying arc as the crew fought to keep control. The sudden change in direction sent another shockwave rippling through the ship, and Voss heard a muffled crash from somewhere behind him, a sound that spoke of chaos and damage. "We've lost primary propulsion," the officer at the helm shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Secondary systems are offline. We're drifting." "Damn it!" Voss snapped. His mind worked frantically, calculating their next move. "Can we reach the human fleet's last known position?" "Not without taking fire," came the strained reply. "They've locked us in." The bridge fell into a heavy silence as everyone processed the dire situation. The humans had lured them in, baiting them with false signals, drawing them closer until they were trapped, vulnerable. Voss could feel it, the suffocating pressure of a plan they had never seen coming. Voss clenched his jaw. He could already see the enemy closing in. The humans, once thought to be retreating, were circling them like wolves around a dying beast. They were patient, they were watching, and the longer they remained passive, the more confident they became. The enemy ships hovered at the edges of the battlefield, their dark silhouettes barely visible, blending seamlessly with the endless expanse of space. But something in the way they positioned themselves made Voss's gut twist. They weren't just waiting to strike, they were watching, studying their every move. "Full power to the shields now," Voss growled, "and get me a direct line to the fleet. We're not done yet." His words hung in the air, but deep down, Voss knew the truth. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a struggle for control. Control of the battlefield, control of their future, control of the one thing the humans seemed to hold most precious, their own unpredictability. And somewhere in the blackness of space the humans watched, waiting to see just how far Voss would push. Voss's hands tightened around the command console, fingers digging into the smooth metal as the ship groaned beneath him. His chest was tight, each breath sharp and ragged as he watched the screens flicker with the advance of the human fleet. They were closing in, but not in the way he'd expected. There was no overwhelming rush, no chaotic barrage of firepower. Instead, the humans had woven themselves into the fabric of space, slipping closer with the grace of predators, silent and calculating. "We're surrounded, sir," the tactical officer said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of inevitability. "There's no escape route left." Voss's jaw clenched, eyes flicking between the tactical map and the viewport. The enemy ships, silent, agile, had spread out like a net, drawing them in with unnerving precision. The entire fleet was now caught in a delicate web. It wasn't a matter of brute force anymore. The humans had trapped them, but they didn't need to fire the first shot. They had the upper hand, and they were waiting, watching. "Focus on their movements," Voss commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Analyze the fleet's formation. They're not attacking. Not yet." The crew worked quickly, their eyes darting between screens, fingers flying over buttons and holographic displays. The tension in the room grew thick, heavy. The hum of the ship's systems was muted, drowned out by the tightening coil of fear that seemed to creep through the walls. Everyone knew it. They were playing a game they hadn't even realized they'd entered. "Commander," the communications officer interrupted, voice trembling. "I'm getting a signal. It's human. It's from a direct line, but—" "Put it through," Voss ordered, his voice sharp, cutting through the confusion. The screen flickered, and a face appeared, barely visible at first. A human officer, young, features unreadable, appeared on the screen. His eyes locked with Voss's for a brief moment, and the cold smile that spread across his face sent a jolt through Voss's chest. "We're in your backyard now," the human officer's voice rang out, calm and controlled like he was delivering a casual greeting. "You might want to make yourself comfortable. This isn't going to end the way you think." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only the sharp, metallic aftertaste of his words hanging in the air. For a long moment no one moved. The crew stared at the screen in stunned silence. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was a statement. Voss could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. It wasn't just a war anymore. The humans weren't looking to crush them. They were playing a deeper game, one that Voss couldn't yet understand. His stomach twisted with a mixture of unease and recognition. These humans had been a mystery since the beginning, and now they were offering the strangest of riddles. "Get me a full scan of their fleet," Voss said, his voice firm, but tinged with the rising anxiety that crawled under his skin. "We need to know exactly what we're up against." The tactical officer's hands moved swiftly across the controls, pulling up readings that appeared on the main screen. There was nothing extraordinary about their fleet's composition. Simple ships, lightly armed, unassuming. And yet, everything about their positioning, their movement felt wrong. Voss's instincts flared. This wasn't about firepower. This wasn't about numbers. It was about something deeper, something more. "What are they waiting for?" the officer beside Voss muttered. "Why don't they strike?" "Because they don't need to," Voss replied, his voice low. "They know they've already won." The sound of the communication officer's voice broke his train of thought. "Commander, we've received a new transmission. It's a broadcast." The screen shifted, and this time, a new message filled the viewport. The transmission was encrypted, but Voss had no doubt about its origin. It was human. Another taunt, another calculated message. The voice that came through the speaker was calm, matter-of-fact. "This is the second message from the United Earth Forces. Surrender now, or face the consequences." The words were simple, but the implication was suffocating. There was no threat in the voice, no anger, just an unsettling certainty. Voss stood still, his eyes narrowing as he watched the transmission cut out, replaced by the tactical display once more. The invaders were waiting for them to make a move. The silence between them was a weapon, one that he couldn't quite decipher. "They're drawing us in," Voss said, the pieces clicking together in his mind. "They want us to engage, but we won't. Not until we understand their play." "Sir," the communications officer interrupted, "we've got incoming. It's fast." Voss turned, eyes snapping to the display. The humans weren't just lurking anymore. They were closing in. This wasn't a full-scale attack, but it didn't need to be. They had waited long enough, and now the final move was coming. "They're coming at us from all angles," the officer reported. "We won't be able to avoid the engagement for much longer." Voss's mind raced. The situation had shifted from a standoff to a full-blown assault, but even as his ship began to prepare its countermeasures, Voss couldn't shake the feeling that the humans weren't trying to win with force. They were trying to win with patience. And now, after all the careful preparation, it was their turn to make a final decision. "Brace for impact," Voss ordered, his voice cold as the ship's systems powered up. He knew what was coming, and for the first time, the realization hit him like a physical blow. The battle was no longer just a matter of firepower or tactics. The humans were playing a much longer game. They were changing the entire nature of warfare, and they had been setting the stage for this moment from the very beginning. The ship lurched, the sharp screech of metal filling the air as the first salvo tore through the shields. The crew scrambled, but the panic had a strange undertone now, a realization that had been festering for days. This wasn't just a war, it was a test. And Voss realized, far too late, that the humans had already won. Through the viewport, the enemy fleet seemed to fade into the distance once more. The battle, however, was far from over. Something much larger loomed on the horizon, and the question was no longer how they would win, but whether they could survive. And the humans? They were still watching, still waiting. The ship was shuddering, rattling beneath Voss's feet as another wave of enemy fire struck. The sound of metal groaning under pressure filled the bridge like an iron beast struggling to stay alive. The steady thrum of the ship's internal systems was now a muffled rhythm, drowned out by the growing panic in the crew. The attack was relentless, each strike carrying the weight of a decision that had already been made. But the humans, those elusive, relentless beings, were no longer in the shadows. They were here, in full force, and Voss could feel it. They were not only fighting, they were controlling the outcome of the war with each calculated move. "Sir, shields are at 30%, the officer at the helm reported, her voice strained. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her eyes were focused, unwilling to meet Voss's gaze. "We can't take much more of this." Voss didn't respond immediately. His gaze was locked on the viewport, watching as the human ships shifted position with eerie precision. They weren't overwhelming him with sheer force. They were dismantling him piece by piece. It was as if they knew exactly where to strike, where his fleet was weakest. Every attack felt like a calculated decision, as if the humans were not just fighting for survival, but for dominance. "We're being toyed with," Voss muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He gripped the edge of the command table, his knuckles white. "They're letting us bleed slowly." A shiver ran through the bridge crew, the words hanging in the air like a cold wind. There was a strange stillness after the last barrage, an almost unnatural silence that clung to the room. Even the officers were holding their breath, waiting for something, anything to break the tension. "Commander, we've intercepted a new signal," the communications officer spoke, breaking the silence. His voice was tight, as though he already knew what the message would be. "It's from the humans. They've activated a new system. It's unlike anything we've seen before." "Put it through!" Voss snapped, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to hear it or not, but the message was coming and there was no avoiding it now. The screen flickered to life, revealing the same human officer from earlier. This time his expression was different. Cold, calculating, but there was something else in his eyes. It was a look of confidence, of absolute certainty. "We warned you," the officer said, his voice smooth without the edge of malice. "But you never listened. Now you'll see what happens when you underestimate us." Voss's heart skipped a beat. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was suffocating. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice strained with frustration. The humans were playing a game, and he wasn't sure what the stakes were anymore. "You've already lost," the officer replied, leaning slightly forward as though to emphasize his point. "Your fleet is falling apart, your systems are compromised, and your crew, well, they're beginning to panic. You may be able to run for a while longer, but soon you'll find yourselves completely cut off from your allies, from everything." Voss's breath caught in his chest. He hadn't fully understood the scope of the situation until now. It wasn't just a matter of winning the battle anymore. The humans were stripping away everything. His fleet, his command, his control. They were erasing the very foundations of his power. "Prepare for complete communication blackout," the officer continued, his voice colder now. "You won't be able to reach anyone. You'll be isolated. Alone." The transmission ended, leaving the room heavy with the weight of his words. Voss stood motionless, his mind racing. He had underestimated them, again. The humans weren't just attacking his fleet. They were targeting everything he relied on: his communication, his strategy, his alliances. "Shut down all non-essential systems," Voss ordered, his voice tight with urgency. "Prepare for the worst." The crew scrambled to comply, fingers moving frantically over consoles, trying to stem the bleeding, to hold the ship together long enough for something, anything, to turn the tide. But Voss knew it wouldn't be enough. They were bleeding and no one was coming to help. "Commander?" The officer at the tactical station spoke hesitantly. "We've detected a small fleet near the outer rim of our defenses. It's human, silent, no weapons fire. But their approach, it's strategic." "What are they doing?" Voss asked, his voice strained. "They're surrounding us," came the reply. "Not with force, with silence." Voss felt the weight of those words sink in, deeper than any blow. The humans were playing with him, turning his own tactics against him. They weren't just isolating him. They were suffocating him, piece by piece, with every calculated move. And the worst part? He had no idea how to stop them. "We're being dragged into the center of their game," Voss said, his voice low. He could feel his pulse quicken as the realization settled in. "They know our every move before we make it. We're not fighting a war. We're fighting a strategy. A game, Commander, we—" The tactical officer's voice cut off as another violent tremor shook the ship. The force was so powerful it sent Voss stumbling forward. He barely managed to catch himself against the console. The ship groaned again, its hull cracking under the pressure. Something was breaking, something fundamental. "Status report," Voss shouted, his voice rising in desperation. His grip tightened on the console, his mind scrambling for something, anything, to hold on to. "Shields have collapsed in the aft section," the officer at the helm shouted. "Engines are offline. Secondary systems are failing." The bridge erupted into a frenzy as officers shouted orders, scrambling to make sense of the situation. The air was thick with the stench of burning wires and overheated circuitry. The smell of smoke lingered, sharp and suffocating. It wasn't just a technical failure. It was a complete breakdown. "Get us out of here," Voss roared. "Activate the escape pods, now." But even as the crew scrambled to execute his orders, Voss knew the truth. It wasn't enough. There was no escape from this. They had been lured into a trap, and now they were too deep to get out. Outside the viewport, the human ship circled, waiting. Their movements were calculated, deliberate, as if they knew exactly how the battle would unfold. And Voss, he was nothing more than a pawn in their game. The final blow hadn't come yet, but it was coming. And when it did, it would be more than just a defeat. It would be the end of everything. Voss gripped the command console with a fury he hadn't felt in years. The ship groaned beneath him, a shudder of steel under pressure as sparks flew from damaged panels, the acrid sting of burning circuits permeating the air. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not from the heat, but from the crushing realization that they were running out of time. Every move they made, every tactic they executed, felt like a response to a game that had already been won. And the humans? They were still playing with him, watching him squirm. "Commander," the tactical officer said, his voice hoarse, "we've lost all external communications. There's no way to contact the fleet. It's just us now." Voss didn't respond immediately. He had always been good at thinking through his options, at assessing the odds and finding a way to turn the tide. But here, in this moment, everything was stacked against him. The humans had cut them off completely. They weren't just waiting for a chance to strike. They were holding all the cards. And yet there was one thing Voss knew for certain. The humans weren't invincible. There had to be a way out. a way to disrupt their strategy. "Get me a full scan of their fleet," Voss ordered, his voice tight but still firm. "We're not finished yet." The communications officer worked quickly, his fingers flying over the console. The data flickered onto the screen, revealing the fleet's positions, still closing in, but not in the rush Voss had expected. They were deliberate, almost leisurely in their approach. And that's when it hit him. The humans weren't attacking in a rush. They weren't trying to win with sheer force. They were waiting for something. They were waiting for him to make the first mistake. "Hold steady," Voss commanded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the tactical map. "They're waiting for us to react. They think they have us cornered, but they're wrong." The crew around him watched in silence, sensing the shift in their commander's demeanor. Voss wasn't panicking anymore. His mind was racing through every possibility, every strategy they had at their disposal. He had to turn this around. He had to make a move before the humans closed in completely. "Status on the damaged systems?" Voss asked, not taking his eyes off the display. "We've patched up as much as we can," the engineer replied, her voice steady but tinged with worry. "But the primary propulsion is still offline. We can't outrun them." "We don't need to outrun them," Voss said, his eyes flicking back to the tactical map. "We need to make them think they've already won." The room fell quiet as his officers processed the implications of his words. Voss wasn't talking about fighting back with force. He wasn't talking about outrunning them or engaging in another firefight. What they needed now was misdirection. The humans had underestimated their ability to adapt, to think strategically. Now, Voss would use that against them. He turned to the tactical officer. "Prepare for a feint. We're going to make them think we're vulnerable." "Feint, sir?" the officer asked, clearly confused. Voss nodded. "We'll simulate a weakness in the aft. Make them think we're preparing to break off and flee. They'll see it and they'll pounce." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "Understood, sir." Voss's mind raced as he continued to piece together the plan. "Once they make their move, we'll trigger a full system overload. It'll fry their sensors for a brief moment, just enough for us to break through." "And what if they don't take the bait?" the tactical officer asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "They will," Voss replied with a sharpness that cut through the tension. "The humans are too confident. They think they have us right where they want us. That's their weakness." The strategy was risky, but it was the only option they had left. Voss's heart pounded as he waited for his crew to execute their part. Every moment stretched out, the silence of space pressing in on them, the calm before the storm. The tension in the air was palpable, thick, suffocating. He could feel it, the weight of the decision resting on his shoulders. If this failed, they wouldn't get another chance. "Feint sequence initiated," the tactical officer said after a long pause, his voice steady. "They've detected it. The humans are closing in." Voss clenched his fists. "Now, wait for the signal." The crew held their breath, their eyes glued to the screens. The human fleet was closing in, still unaware of the trap that had been set. Voss could feel the seconds stretching like hours, his pulse quickening as he waited for the perfect moment. The ship's trembling underfoot seemed to echo through his bones. The slightest mistake now could be their last. And then the signal came, a pulse of energy, low and steady. It was a small crack in the armor of their strategy, but enough to send a ripple through the human fleet. The moment they saw the signal, the humans would assume victory. They would think Voss had exposed the weak point they had been searching for, and that's when he would strike. "Now!" Voss shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. The crew moved swiftly, executing the plan with precision. The simulated weakness in the aft grew worse, a carefully timed overload that triggered a series of malfunctions. The ship groaned as it shifted, the sensors going dark. Voss watched the human fleet's movements with a tight focus. He could almost hear them, feel them closing in. But this time, they were moving into his trap. The moment the humans shifted their focus, the crew triggered the overload. A surge of energy rippled through the ship, blinding the human sensors for a critical few moments. Voss's heart pounded as the display flickered, showing the human fleet thrown into disarray. Their ships, once so confident, now hesitated, scrambling to recalibrate. "Now!" Voss ordered, his voice full of cold resolve. "Get us moving! Full speed!" The ship lurched forward, jerking with a sudden burst of power. The human fleet, temporarily blinded, was slow to react. Voss watched as the lead ship faltered, their formation breaking apart as they scrambled to regain control. "Full thrust now!" Voss barked. The ship shot forward with a surge of energy, the blast of speed almost knocking Voss off his feet. He gripped the console, his eyes locked on the screen as they barreled toward the only escape route left. The humans, still trying to adjust to the chaos they'd created for themselves, were now at their mercy. "We've broken through," the communications officer exclaimed, his voice full of disbelief. "We're out of their trap." Voss allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before his focus snapped back to the mission. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The humans had been forced to react, but that didn't mean they were finished. They would regroup. They would come after them, with renewed force. "We've won this round," Voss muttered, his voice steady but filled with the cold reality of war. "But it's not over. Not yet." And somewhere in the blackness of space, the humans were already preparing their next move. The bridge was still, too still. The comms were silent, the air thick with anticipation. The ship had slipped through the enemy's grasp, but Voss knew the humans would not let them escape without a final fight. The fleeting victory felt hollow in the vastness of space, as if the very stars themselves had become a part of the game that he too was now a part of. There was no room for celebration, no comfort in the fleeting relief. The enemy fleet was regathering, closing in on them with the same precision they always had, and Voss could feel the tension mounting. They had bought time, but how much time remained? Voss stood at the helm, eyes fixed on the viewports as he ran his fingers along the edge of the console. The metallic surface under his hand was cool, unyielding. This was it, the final move. The humans had already turned the tide once before, and now they were circling, waiting for the next slip, the next weakness to exploit. And in the silence of their approach, Voss knew that they had already won. They had already outlasted the toughest challenge. "Sir, incoming fleet," the tactical officer reported, his voice tight with strain. "They're accelerating. They've got us in their sights." Voss didn't flinch. The ship might be crippled, their systems might be failing, but their spirit, humanity's spirit, wasn't something that could be extinguished with a simple strike. He had learned that much in these long, grueling hours of combat. These humans fought not just with weapons, but with something else, something deeper, a force that no one could fully understand. "We're not finished yet," Voss said, his voice a whisper at first, but as he spoke it grew stronger, surging with the weight of his realization. "Prepare for full engagement." The crew, exhausted but resolute, nodded and went to work, responding to his words with the kind of precision that had become their hallmark. Voss could feel the charge of energy, the spark of life as they prepared for the final confrontation. But this time, he wasn't just commanding a fight. He was leading them into the unknown, into something far more dangerous than a simple battle. This was a test of everything they had. "You've made a mistake, Commander." A calm, familiar voice crackled through the comms. The human officer's voice, steady and filled with an almost cruel confidence, slipped into Voss's mind like a shadow. "You can fight and you can resist, but you will never outlast us." Voss's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as the voice echoed in his mind. "We don't need to outlast you. We only need to outsmart you." A pause, long enough to feel like an eternity, before the voice replied, "We shall see." With that, the transmission cut off. Voss's heart raced. His plan had been simple, to turn the humans' strategy against them, to use their overconfidence as their downfall. But the more he saw, the more he understood. The humans were relentless, yes, but not in the way that others were. They didn't rush into battle with rage. They didn't fight with sheer force. No, they fought with time. They wore you down bit by bit, until the only option left was to surrender or be consumed by the pressure. The human fleet was now on top of them. Voss could see their ships closing in through the viewport, sleek and deadly, but still distant. The air was thick, the silence nearly deafening. His crew stood at their stations, their faces grim. They had done everything they could to survive, but now the final clash was here. The humans were closing in. The moment was fast approaching. "Engage evasive maneuvers," Voss said, his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around him. He had a plan, but it was unlike anything they had done before. The time for fighting in the conventional sense was over. He was going to push them to their limit, break their rhythm, and turn the table once and for all. The ship lurched as the crew responded. The feeling was electric, the sudden movement jarring, but Voss kept his gaze locked on the approaching human fleet. He could feel the tension stretching tighter with every passing second. The humans knew how to play the long game, but Voss was about to show them that he knew how to finish one. "Prepare the countermeasures," Voss commanded. "We will make them think they've won, and then we'll hit them where they least expect it." The tactical officer's fingers flew across the console, setting the trap. Outside, the human ships closed in, their movements methodical and precise. They thought they had this battle in the bag. They thought they had the upper hand. But Voss had spent years learning how to fight a war. He wasn't about to let the humans prove him wrong. "Now," Voss said, his voice steady as he initiated the final sequence. The ship suddenly surged forward, breaking free from its momentary stall, streaking into the heart of the human fleet. For a heartbeat, it felt like time stopped. The enemy ships faltered, their sensors momentarily blinded by the sudden burst of power. In that moment, Voss saw the fear flash across the faces of his crew. They were beginning to understand what he was doing. "Full weapons!" Voss shouted, his voice cutting through the hesitation. The crew responded with precision, their years of training converging into a single, focused moment. Then, with a sound that shook the entire ship, their weapon systems engaged, a surge of power that tore through the human fleet's outermost defenses, pushing through their shields with the ferocity of a storm. The human fleet staggered back, but they were too slow to respond. Voss had them right where he wanted them. The next few moments were a blur of light and motion, a brutal reminder of what happens when you underestimate humanity. The tactical officer watched in awe as their weapons cut through the remaining enemy ships like a blade through silk. The humans had underestimated their adaptability, their sheer will to survive. They had thought they had Voss's fleet cornered, but in reality, they had underestimated him. The battle wasn't about who had the most ships or the strongest weapons. It was about who could adapt, who could outsmart the other. And in the end, it was humanity's unyielding spirit that proved superior. As the last human ships fell away, the silence that followed felt different. It wasn't victory that filled the air, but something else. The weight of the realization that the battle was never about firepower. It had always been about the human spirit, the ability to rise again, to adapt and to win, no matter the odds. Voss stood still, his chest rising and falling in the stillness of space. His crew began to stir, their faces still grim. But now something had changed. They had survived. They had fought back. And though the humans were still out there, still watching, Voss knew one thing for certain. Humanity had earned its place in the galaxy. The final rule was clear. Never ever underestimate humans. The galaxy would learn that lesson the hard way.